Hey, get away from the door. We don't serve filthy beggars here. Move it. The brutal words pierced through the biting winter air like a knife. Joseph froze in place, his trembling hand just inches from the polished brass handle of the Maison de Lumière café. The morning wind whipped at his threadbare brown coat, tugging the thin fabric against his frail frame. His cracked leather shoes scraped awkwardly on the icy pavement as he slowly lowered his hand. The woman who had shouted stood tall and imposing in the doorway. Veronica, the hostess, immaculate in a tailored black blazer and deep red scarf, stared down at Joseph as though he were a stain on the pristine steps. She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing with cold disapproval. "I only wanted to buy a cup of coffee," Joseph said softly, meeting her stare with a tired, calm dignity. Inside, the warm glow of the cafe beckoned invitingly. Elegant patrons sat at tables covered with fine linen and golden cutlery, sipping espresso and nibbling on delicate pastries. Their conversations and laughter floated toward the windows. "Our clientele expects a certain standard," Veronica replied sharply, her voice dripping with condescension. "There's a shelter down the block. I suggest you try there." Joseph looked past her into the cafe. His breath fogged the glass as he gazed longingly at the steaming cups of coffee and cozy velvet chairs. A sharply dressed man seated by the window chuckled as he noticed the exchange. "Look at that old guy. Probably hasn't had a bath in weeks. Thinks they're going to let him in?" His female companion laughed, brushing her sleek hair behind her ear as she lifted her delicate cup. "The homeless don't know their place anymore." Joseph remained still, his shoulders squared despite the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. "Please, ma'am, just a hot coffee? Nothing more." Veronica's lips curled cruelly. "You're disturbing the atmosphere. Leave, or I'll call security." She waved toward the security desk. "Reggie, escort this man off the property." Reggie, the cafe's towering security guard, hesitated. He stepped forward slowly, his boots heavy against the stone floor. His eyes softened slightly as he studied Joseph's worn appearance and calm composure. "Sir, you'll have to leave," Reggie said gruffly but quietly. "Please don't make this any harder." Joseph sighed deeply, brushing the snowflakes from his sleeve with a shaking hand. "I understand, but when I return, have your manager waiting?" Veronica scoffed audibly, flipping her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder as she turned on her heel and disappeared back inside. Reggie lingered, watching Joseph for a long second before stepping back to his post. As Joseph shuffled away from the cafe, his scarf flapped behind him like a worn flag in the wind. A bitter chill stung his cheeks, but he walked steadily onward. A group of young people stood nearby, bundled in designer coats, their expensive smartphones aimed at Joseph as he walked past. "Is he serious?" one of them sneered. "He thinks they're going to serve him. Get this on video." They laughed and filmed while Joseph, oblivious to their mockery, continued down the snow-dusted sidewalk. His breath came out in soft white clouds. The insults faded behind him, replaced by the distant sound of honking taxis and hurried footsteps. The gusting wind tugged mercilessly at his coat. Yet beneath the layers of humiliation and cold, a faint, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. On the opposite corner of the street, a homeless veteran in a tattered army jacket, leaning on crutches, paused and gave Joseph a nod of solidarity. Joseph returned the nod silently, understanding the unspoken bond between those whom society had deemed invisible. The air outside was bitter, unlike the cold indifference inside. Joseph thought back to where it all began. The memory washed over him vividly. The streets of Chicago had always been cold, but they had never felt colder than that day. The morning crowd streamed past without a second glance. An elderly woman with a designer handbag pulled it protectively closer as she hurried by. A pair of well-dressed young executives stopped mid-conversation to glare at Joseph with barely concealed disgust. The taller one muttered under his breath, "Another bum trying to hustle a free handout. Pathetic." His companion nodded and chuckled. Joseph kept his pace slow and steady, ignoring the stares and whispers. A city bus roared by, kicking up a cloud of slush and ice that splashed his shoes and soaked the frayed hem of his coat. Joseph winced slightly but kept walking. He passed the grand entrance of a luxury department store. Behind the sparkling glass displays, mannequins wore suits that cost more than Joseph had spent on clothing in the last decade. A salesman inside spotted him lingering and quickly drew the heavy velvet curtain closed. A young mother briskly pushed a stroller past Joseph, shooting him a fearful glance as though his mere presence might somehow harm her child. Joseph stopped at the corner as the traffic light turned red. Standing under the dull green glow of a street lamp, Joseph raised his gaze to the towering buildings above. The massive glass and steel structures seemed to sneer down at him. Their cold reflections reminded him just how invisible he had become in the city he once loved. A sudden gust whipped past, nearly yanking his scarf from around his neck. He clutched it tightly with weathered hands. As he crossed the street, an expensive black sports car screeched to a halt inches from his feet. "Watch where you're going, you old fool," the driver yelled through the open window before speeding off with a roar of the engine. Joseph stood motionless, blinking against the wind as the car disappeared into the distance. He took a deep breath and resumed walking. Farther down the block, he reached a familiar alleyway between two worn brick buildings. It was there that he had spent many nights during the hardest years, sheltering from the elements under sheets of cardboard and faded tarps. Now he simply paused and stared for a long moment, a mix of pain and resolve etched into his features. He turned away and walked on, knowing where he needed to go next. With each step, Joseph's determination hardened. He knew that within those cold walls of Maison de Lumière, decisions would be made about people like him without ever considering their dignity. The faces that had stared and laughed would remain comfortably unaware of the truth they were about to learn. As he approached the next corner, a sleek black sedan rolled to a smooth stop beside him. The rear door opened silently. A driver in a dark suit stepped out and bowed his head slightly. "Mr. King," the driver said respectfully. "Are you ready to return?" Joseph nodded and smiled faintly. "Yes, let's go. It's time," Sermon reminded. The door closed behind him with a quiet thud. The car merged back into the slow stream of traffic as Joseph leaned back in the soft leather seat, gazing out at the snow falling softly onto the city that had taught him both cruelty and strength. As the car glided smoothly through the streets, Joseph closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the beginning. The cold of Chicago's winter faded from his senses as memories from decades earlier began to surface. Joseph was transported back to the 1950s South Side, where the streets were lined with weathered brick buildings and the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and baked bread from corner bakeries. Children raced along cracked sidewalks, their laughter echoing off the faded walls of tightly packed apartments. The worn curtains fluttered in the breeze from open windows, revealing families crowded into tiny rooms. Joseph had been one of those children. He remembered the narrow, crumbling apartment he shared with his parents and two siblings. The walls had been thin, the floors creaked with every step, and the wind howled through the gaps in the window panes during the brutal Chicago winters. His mother, a quiet woman with tired eyes and calloused hands, worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families in the North Side. His father, a strong but gentle man, labored long hours at the steel mill to keep food on the table. Despite their sacrifices, money was always tight. As a boy, Joseph learned early the value of hard work. He delivered newspapers before dawn, shining shoes on busy corners after school, and collected empty bottles for pennies. The world rarely noticed him, but his resolve only strengthened. He remembered one particular winter morning when, at just 10 years old, he stood in tattered boots with holes at the toes waiting for customers on a windswept street corner. The snow fell relentlessly, soaking through his thin coat, but Joseph stood proudly, determined to earn what he could. The memory of that biting wind and the ache of cold toes remained with him even now, a testament to the lessons that had shaped his life. He had faced poverty, hunger, and indifference, but he had never surrendered his dignity. As the car turned another corner, Joseph opened his eyes and looked out at the towering skyline. He smiled faintly, remembering where he had come from, and knowing that his journey was far from over. Joseph's memories drifted further, settling on the long afternoons he spent at the public library. There, surrounded by dusty books and the soft whispers of turning pages, he found his escape. He devoured volumes on carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, and basic engineering. The knowledge became his refuge and his weapon against the hopelessness that surrounded him. When he was old enough, Joseph took on odd jobs around the neighborhood. He patched leaking roofs, fixed broken stairs, painted walls, and mended fences. He saved every dollar he earned, stuffing crumpled bills into a jar hidden under the loose floorboard of his bedroom. At night, long after his siblings were asleep, Joseph lay awake under the thin blanket, staring at the cracked ceiling, dreaming of one day owning a building of his own, a place he could repair, restore, and offer to families like his who had so little. That dream sustained him through the hardest of days. It was not about riches or fame, but about creating something lasting and meaningful. On weekends, Joseph would help elderly neighbors with chores they could no longer manage. He carried heavy groceries up the narrow apartment stairwells, shoveled snow from sidewalks at dawn, and climbed rickety ladders to clean out clogged gutters. They repaid him with hot cocoa, warm smiles, and the priceless gift of trust. Despite the long hours and constant fatigue, Joseph never complained. The work gave him purpose and pride. Slowly, he became known as the boy who could fix anything. Word spread, and soon he was repairing leaking faucets and squeaky doors for people all over the neighborhood. Every dollar went into his secret jar. Every blistered hand and scraped knee was a step closer to his dream. His parents, though exhausted and worn down by life's hardships, looked at him with quiet admiration. They knew their son had a determination stronger than steel. The nights were the hardest. Lying awake, staring at the cracked ceiling as winter winds howled outside, Joseph would close his eyes and picture a building of his own. Not grand or ornate, but safe and warm. A place where families like his would never have to worry about broken pipes or leaking roofs. The dream burned brightly inside him, a beacon against the darkness of poverty. And though he had no way of knowing then, that unshakable vision would one day change not only his life, but the lives of countless others. By the time he turned 20, Joseph had enough saved to purchase a decrepit, two-flat building at the edge of the neighborhood. The bank laughed at his loan request, and real estate agents dismissed him as a foolish dreamer. But Joseph was undeterred. He negotiated directly with the desperate owner, scraped together his modest savings, and signed the papers with shaking hands. The building was a crumbling mess, its windows boarded, pipes leaking, and roof sagging dangerously. Neighbors whispered and shook their heads. "He'll never fix it. It's a lost cause." Joseph smiled to himself as he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Years later, as the sleek black sedan slowed once more in front of Maison de Lumière, Joseph opened his eyes and smiled faintly. It was time to return. The car eased to a stop at the curb in front of Maison de Lumière. Joseph opened his eyes and straightened his scarf. The soft interior light of the luxury sedan bathed his weathered face in a warm glow. The driver stepped out and opened the door with a quiet, respectful gesture. The sharp wind rushed in as Joseph stepped out onto the snowy sidewalk. His shoes crunched against the thin layer of fresh powder as he stood for a moment, staring up at the grand facade of the building. The towering glass windows reflected the city lights, and the golden sign above the door gleamed under the street lamps. Joseph inhaled deeply, his breath forming soft clouds in the frigid air. He ran a gloved hand over the lapel of his worn coat, smoothing it absent-mindedly. The same coat he had worn earlier that morning, the one that had prompted Veronica to dismiss him so cruelly. The air outside was bitter, but Joseph felt calm. A quiet strength radiated from within him now. Decades of experience, heartbreak, perseverance, and hard-earned success had brought him back to this very spot. He glanced up and down the street. Couples hurried past, their laughter echoing through the cold. Cars honked impatiently at the intersection. The city moved on, oblivious to the moment unfolding on this small corner of Chicago. Joseph stepped forward deliberately. His shoes made soft, steady sounds against the pavement. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of anticipation. He had returned not as the outcast who had been turned away hours earlier, but as the owner of the very building he approached. The golden handle of Maison de Lumière's door glinted invitingly under the warm glow of the entryway lights. Joseph reached out slowly, his gloved fingers brushing against the cool metal. The door swung open with a soft chime. Warm air, rich with the aroma of freshly ground coffee and baked pastries, embraced him as he stepped inside. Conversations hummed low across the polished mahogany floors. The ornate crystal chandeliers scattered golden light over velvet drapes and dark wood accents. Heads turned, en table sur un apron. Conversations halted. Veronica, standing near the hostess podium with an air of detached superiority, froze mid-sentence. Her eyes narrowed with immediate recognition. "You again," she sneered, her voice sharp enough to slice through the heavy silence. "I thought I told you." Before she could finish, Joseph calmly pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. He handed it to her with steady hands. Veronica's expression shifted from irritation to confusion as she unfolded the thick paper. Her eyes scanned the lines and her face paled. "The deed to the building. I am not here to cause trouble," Joseph said evenly. "I'm here as the owner." A hush fell over the room. Patrons watched in stunned silence, forks poised midair, espresso cups forgotten in trembling fingers. Veronica stumbled, her voice barely a whisper now. This can't be real." Reggie, the security guard, stepped forward uncertainly. Confusion etched across his broad face. His eyes flickered between Joseph and Veronica. "Mr. King?" he asked hesitantly. Joseph nodded. "Yes, Reggie. That's me." Reggie's shoulders relaxed. A small sheepish smile crept onto his face. Veronica, trembling, tried to maintain composure. There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake," Joseph replied calmly. "I've owned this property for years. Today, I simply chose to visit." Gasps echoed softly through the cafe. The sharply dressed businessman who had ridiculed Joseph earlier sank into his seat, avoiding eye contact. The influencer group by the window stopped recording and stared wide-eyed. Joseph turned to Reggie. "Would you be so kind as to fetch the general manager? I believe we have much to discuss." Reggie nodded respectfully. "Right away, Mr. King." Joseph stepped aside, standing with quiet dignity as murmurs rippled through the stunned crowd. The door at the back of the cafe opened, and a tall man in an impeccably tailored Navy suit stepped out. His silver hair was combed back neatly, and a gold name tag pinned to his lapel read Mr. Lancaster, Schwenewin, Drenhonern, General Manager. His sharp eyes scanned the tense scene. Veronica rushed over, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "Sir, there's been some kind of misunderstanding. This man claims he owns Mr. Lancaster held up a hand, silencing her. His gaze settled on Joseph, who stood calm and poised, the document still in Veronica's trembling hands. "Mr. King," he said slowly, realization dawning. "It has been many years." "Indeed," Joseph replied, offering a small, knowing smile. "But some things are worth returning for." Mr. Lancaster nodded, his stern expression softening with respect. "I deeply apologize for the way you were treated." Veronica stared in stunned disbelief. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. "Please, Mr. King, come with me to my office, Mr. Lancaster said, stepping aside and motioning politely. As Joseph walked through the cafe, a ripple of whispers followed. Heads bowed slightly. Some patrons looked ashamed. Others watched in silent awe. The businessman who had mocked him earlier now stared down at his untouched cappuccino. The influencer group silently lowered their phones, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Reggie held the door open for Joseph and gave him a respectful nod. "Welcome home, sir." Joseph paused at the threshold, turning back one last time to survey the once hostile room. His voice was calm but carried unmistakable weight. "Let this be a reminder to everyone. You never know who you are turning away." With that, he stepped through the door, and it clicked shut behind him, leaving the cafe in hushed silence. The wind howled softly outside as if echoing the justice that had just unfolded inside. Joseph stood tall and steady, ready to reclaim not only the building, but the dignity of every soul who had ever been cast aside. The heavy office door shut with a soft click behind Joseph as he stepped into the plush, wood-paneled sanctuary that served as Mr. Lancaster's private office. Tall bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes and framed certificates. A large mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface pristine except for a sleek black folder. Mr. Lancaster motioned to an upholstered chair. "Please have a seat, Mr. Kingayer Westshome." Joseph lowered himself into the chair with quiet dignity, his eyes briefly scanning the familiar space. Mr. Lancaster settled into his own chair, folded his hands neatly, and regarded Joseph with genuine respect. "I hardly recognized you, Mr. King," Mr. Lancaster said. "It has been a very long time." "Yes," Joseph replied. "Time has a way of humbling and teaching us." Mr. Lancaster nodded solemnly. "I owe you a personal apology. The behavior you were subjected to today was unacceptable. Maison de Lumière has always prided itself on excellence and hospitality. We failed you on both." Joseph waved a hand gently. "I'm not here for apologies, Mr. Lancaster. I've dealt with far worse. But I do intend to make sure no one else ever has to endure what I did this morning." Mr. Lancaster leaned forward slightly. "I understand. What do you propose?" Joseph reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the desk. "Effective immediately, Maison de Lumière will adopt an inclusive service policy. No guest will ever be refused service based on appearance, wealth, or perceived social status." Mr. Lancaster read the document carefully, then looked up and smiled faintly. "I think that's long overdue." "There's more," Joseph continued. "I've also established the King Foundation. It will fund community outreach programs, provide meals and warm clothing to the homeless, and offer job training opportunities to help people rebuild their lives. Mr. Lancaster sat back, visibly impressed. You've turned pain into purpose, Mr. King. Economon din. Joseph's voice softened. I was lucky. I had the strength to keep going. Many don't. It's time we stop judging by appearances and start offering a hand. A moment of thoughtful silence passed between them, the only sound the faint ticking of a brass clock on the shelf. Mr. Lancaster stood and extended his hand across the desk. I am honored to help you in this mission. Joseph shook his hand firmly. Shieni. Yuetsunri. Now let's go back out there and show them what real hospitality looks like. Together, they stepped out of the office into the café. The low murmur of conversations resumed as the patrons watched them emerge. Joseph's presence now commanded a new, unmistakable respect. The atmosphere in the café had transformed entirely. As Joseph and Mr. Lancaster walked back through the main dining area, every head turned. The same patrons who had scoffed and whispered hours earlier now watched in stunned silence. Reggie stood near the entrance, his posture straightening immediately as he caught sight of Joseph. The security guard gave a respectful nod and stepped aside, holding the door open as Joseph passed. Joseph paused and glanced at Veronica, who stood stiffly behind the hostess podium. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief and lingering shame. Veronica, Joseph addressed her calmly. I believe you owe some guests an apology. Veronica's lips parted as if to argue, but the weight of the moment silenced her. Slowly, she bowed her head. Yes, Mr. King, you're right. The influencer group at the corner table lowered their phones, whispering among themselves, suddenly aware of the gravity of what they had witnessed. The sharply dressed businessman who had earlier mocked Joseph stared deeply into his coffee, unable to meet Joseph's gaze. Mr. Lancaster raised his hand to get the room's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the true owner of Maison de Lumière, Mr. Joseph King. A hush fell over the crowd, followed by soft gasps and scattered applause. The applause grew into a wave as realization swept over the patrons. Joseph raised his hand slightly to quiet the crowd. I appreciate your kindness, but this moment is not about me, Joseph said, his voice steady and clear. It's about understanding that every person who walks through these doors deserves dignity and respect, no matter their appearance or circumstance. A woman near the window wiped at her eyes discreetly. A young man in a hoodie, previously ignored by the waitstaff, sat up straighter, his eyes shining with hope. Joseph turned to Mr. Lancaster. What do you want to? I hope this can be the start of something new. It already is, Mr. Lancaster replied warmly. Joseph nodded and stepped forward to shake hands with Reggie. Thank you, Reggie. You treated me with decency even when you didn't know who I was. Reggie smiled broadly. It was the right thing to do, sir. Joseph addressed the room once more. From this day forward, Maison de Lumière will be a place where no one is judged by their clothing, their wealth, or their status. The applause resumed, louder and filled with genuine admiration. Even the influencer group joined in, their earlier mockery forgotten in the face of Joseph's powerful example. As the noise swelled, Joseph smiled faintly, knowing that the true change had just begun. The applause gradually faded into a warm hum of conversation as patrons returned to their meals, their eyes still occasionally drifting toward Joseph in quiet admiration. Joseph stood near the center of the room, letting the moment settle. He glanced at the towering windows, where the early evening light cast long golden rays across the polished floors. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the glass, softening the sharp edges of the city beyond. Mr. Lancaster approached Joseph's side. I've never seen this room so unified, he said quietly. Joseph smiled faintly. Respect is a powerful thing when shared. At the back of the cafe, Reggie spoke softly to a group of servers. They nodded quickly, spreading out to greet every customer with renewed warmth and genuine smiles. Veronica lingered near the hostess stand, her proud posture now softened with humility. She hesitated, then approached Joseph. Mr. King, I am truly sorry. I've learned a lesson I won't forget. Joseph studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Let your actions prove it. Yes, sir, she whispered. The sharply dressed businessman who had insulted Joseph earlier quietly approached. He removed his designer scarf and extended his hand. I misjudged you. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Joseph shook his hand firmly. Thank you. I hope you'll remember this moment next time you meet someone you don't know. The man nodded solemnly before returning to his table. The influencer group sat with lowered gazes. One of them mustered the courage to speak. Mr. King, we didn't understand. We shouldn't have filmed you. We're sorry. Joseph's eyes softened. Learn from it. Use your platform to uplift, not tear down. The young influencers nodded eagerly, their faces flushed with sincerity. Joseph exhaled deeply, scanning the room one last time. Where once there had been judgment and cruelty, there was now compassion and understanding. The bell above the door jingled as a young homeless man in a tattered coat cautiously stepped inside, looking unsure. Joseph locked eyes with Reggie and gave a single nod. Reggie approached the man with a wide, welcoming smile. "Sir, would you like a seat? Can I get you something warm?" The man blinked in surprise, then nodded gratefully. Joseph watched as the man was led to a table and offered hot coffee and a plate of fresh pastries. The warmth and kindness spread like ripples across the room. Joseph slipped quietly toward the exit, his coat brushing softly against the velvet drapes. Outside, the city lights blinked to life one by one against the evening sky. The wind was cold, but it carried with it the promise of change. Joseph smiled softly, tucked his scarf tighter around his neck, and stepped into the night. The door clicked shut behind him, and the screen faded to black. The heavy door of Maison de Lumière closed behind Joseph with a soft click. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold. Snowflakes drifted gently under the golden glow of street lamps. Joseph pulled his scarf tighter and started walking. Each step crunched softly in the fresh snow. As he walked past the grand windows of the café, Joseph paused. Inside, warmth and laughter filled the space that had hours earlier been thick with judgment. Reggie moved confidently among the tables, chatting with guests. Veronica stood attentively by the podium, posture softened with humility. Even the young homeless man Joseph had watched earlier now sat contentedly with a warm cup of coffee and a plate of pastries. A soft smile crept onto Joseph's face. Real change had begun. The streets were quieter now. Joseph passed familiar landmarks that had once felt cold and hostile. The Grand Theater on Michigan Avenue, the towering spires of the old church where he had once taken shelter from winter storms, the bus stop where he had waited long nights with nothing but a thin coat and frayed shoes. His phone buzzed. Joseph pulled it from his coat pocket and answered. "Mr. King," the familiar voice of his foundation's director said. "We've just received the final approval from the city board. The King Foundation is officially operational." "Thank you," Joseph said, relief and purpose filling his voice. "Start immediately. The people need us." The director hesitated. "There's already a line forming outside our office." "Word is spreading." Joseph smiled softly. "Then let's not keep them waiting." By dawn, the King Foundation building was alive with movement. The once abandoned structure had been transformed into a bright beacon of hope. Volunteers bustled between stations, packing boxes with blankets, warm coats, socks, toiletries, and food. Others arranged pamphlets offering free job training, housing referrals, and mental health counseling. A growing crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Families with young children, elderly couples, struggling veterans, young men and women with hollow eyes and worn backpacks, all stood silently in the cold, drawn by whispers of help. Inside, Joseph stood at the window, watching. The first pink hues of sunrise bathed the skyline. His heart swelled. He stepped outside, instantly surrounded by reporters and flashing cameras. "Mr. King," a voice called. "Why reveal yourself now after all these years?" Joseph raised a hand calmly. The noise died instantly. "I was once invisible," he began, his voice even and clear. "I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to be judged by what you wear or how you look. I vowed that if I ever made it, I would make sure no one else ever felt unseen." He paused in scanning the crowd. "The King Foundation exists for all of you. For anyone struggling, for anyone ignored. We will offer food, shelter, jobs, and respect. Every person deserves dignity." A single clap became two. Then a wave of applause surged from the crowd. A young woman near the front wiped her eyes with the sleeve of a threadbare jacket. Joseph continued, "We will rebuild what society abandoned. One block at a time, one family at a time, one life at a time." In the weeks that followed, the city began to change. Community centers opened in neighborhoods once forgotten. Abandoned buildings were converted into safe shelters and transitional housing. Job training programs flourished. The once disillusioned found purpose and hope again. Maison de Lumière became a powerful symbol of the movement. Its once exclusive doors were now wide open to everyone. Reggie welcomed every guest warmly. Veronica worked harder than anyone to ensure that no visitor was turned away. Late one crisp evening, Joseph stood quietly across the street, watching the café glow like a lighthouse against the cold night. Families gathered inside, strangers shared meals, young professionals mentored teenagers seeking a better life. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir." He turned on us, Surinamon. A young woman stood nervously, bundled in a faded coat and scarf. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. "Are you Mr. King?" She shifted awkwardly, clutching a worn backpack. "I just wanted to say thank you. I was homeless last winter. I came to the foundation. I got a job. I have a place now. I'm going back to school." Joseph's expression softened. "I'm proud of you. You've already done the hardest part. Keep going." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded and hurried away into the night. Joseph turned back to the glowing cafe. The wind whispered softly around him. The cold no longer bit as fiercely. He whispered quietly to himself, "One life at a time. That's how we change the world." The camera slowly panned upward, capturing the breathtaking Chicago skyline under a blanket of soft snow. The bright lights of the city shimmered like a promise. Screen fades to black. The cold winds of Chicago swirled gently along the magnificent mile. As Joseph stood silently at the window of his modest office, the King Foundation logo glowed faintly on the glass behind him. Below, the city pulsed with life. Traffic streamed by. People hurried along, bundled in coats, and the first hints of spring teased the late winter air. His assistant, Rachel, knocked softly and stepped in with a tablet in hand. "Sir, the final report just came in. Since launch, over 5,000 individuals have received assistance. 2 new community centers are scheduled to open next month." Joseph nodded without turning. "Thank you, Rachel." She hesitated. "There's more urn. Multiple cities have reached out asking how to replicate the program. New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta. Even internationally. Joseph's gaze softened as he watched a young family laughing as they crossed the street below. "Tell them we'll help," he said. "We've only just begun." Rachel smiled and left quietly. Joseph continued to stand there, the reflection of the city mingling with his own silhouette. That evening, Maison de Lumière was buzzing, not just with patrons but with purpose. The café had become an unofficial community hub. Volunteers held quiet meetings in corners. Local artists displayed paintings that celebrated kindness and resilience. Reggie greeted every visitor with his trademark warmth. Veronica, once cold and aloof, now moved gracefully from table to table, chatting and laughing with the guests. Joseph entered quietly. The bell chimed softly above the door. A group of teenagers, part of the cafe's new mentorship program, spotted him. "Mr. King," one of them called. Joseph smiled warmly as they hurried over. "You were right, sir," a young man in a hoodie said. "I started the apprenticeship. I'm going to be an electrician." Another girl beamed. "I'm studying to become a nurse." Joseph nodded, pride glowing behind his calm demeanor. "I'm proud of you all. Just remember to lift others as you rise." They nodded eagerly, their faces shining with possibility. At a table near the window, Joseph paused. An elderly woman wearing a faded winter coat sipped her coffee, her eyes filled with gratitude. Joseph nodded to her gently. The scene outside shifted. Snow gave way to early buds of spring. The streets, once cold and harsh, were now filled with energy and hope. Maison de Lumière stood proud against the skyline, its windows glowing like a beacon. Inside his office, Joseph looked over framed photos. Families reunited, smiling volunteers, and once homeless individuals now thriving. Rachel knocked again. "Sir, the mayor just called. They want to dedicate a day to honor your work. Joseph King Day." Joseph smiled faintly. "I appreciate it, but this was never about me." He rose, slipped on his long overcoat, and stepped outside into the warm evening air. As he walked down the bustling street, ordinary people stopped to greet him. A bus driver tipped his hat. A street vendor offered him a cup of coffee. Children waved as they passed. Joseph paused at the corner, gazing up at the night sky where city lights danced like stars. Voiceover softens as camera pans wide. His journey was never about recognition. It was about the simple truth he carried from the beginning. Kindness matters. With one last soft smile, Joseph turned and disappeared into the vibrant crowd. The screen slowly fades to black as gentle music plays, signaling the end of the chapter but the beginning of a lasting legacy. The screen remains black as soft, reflective music begins to play. Voiceover calm, steady, heartfelt. The soft crunch of footsteps fades into the vibrant streets of Chicago. Joseph disappears into the crowd, his coat brushing against strangers who do not yet know the legacy walking among them. The cold wind whispers his message into the night. Kindness matters. His journey is over, but his mission has just begun. We live in a world where it is easy to look away, to judge too quickly, to assume and dismiss. But today, You have seen what happens when someone chooses differently. Joseph was once invisible, misjudged, cast aside, but through resilience and compassion, he built a legacy of hope and dignity. Imagine what our world could become if we all chose kindness. What if every passerby, every outstretched hand, every tear-filled eye found understanding instead of rejection? Have you ever misjudged someone based on what they wore or where they stood? Could you be the person who stops, smiles, and helps instead? You can monitor someone. We challenge you right now to commit one small act of kindness today. It can be as simple as a smile, a kind word, a warm meal, or listening to someone who feels unheard. Share your story in the comments below. Inspire others with your experience. Spread hope. Together, let's flood the world with compassion. Join our growing community by liking, sharing, and subscribing to Unveiled Wealth. Here, every video is a journey from darkness to light, from hopelessness to possibility. Let our stories remind you that change is possible, one choice at a time. Use the hashtag #UnveiledWealth to share this message across your social platforms. Let's create a wave of goodness that cannot be ignored. Joseph's footsteps have faded, but the echoes of his message remain. The screen fades, but kindness never fades. Soft music swells and fades out gently. Screen goes black. Thank you.